Yeah, thank you, Kate. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ahmed Abu Rahal, Technical Product Manager at Integrity. I'm glad to be joined by Steve.
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name's Steve Nesbitt. So my role is, as you can see, enablement. So basically, if it's outside of North America, it's me. It's supposed to be Europe, but it also covers Australia, which apparently is in Europe now. But apparently, that's basically what I'm doing. So there you go.
Yeah. So today, I'm going to be talking about data-centric security and why the shift to data-centric security. We'll be talking about some of the challenges that we see our customers facing, and then we'll move to a practical approach, what we do with our customers to move towards a more data-centric security model. So I'm quite sure most of the audience are familiar with this, yeah? Right? Well, here on the screen, this is an access control list, and yeah, you know, I go to a comfortable place when I see an access control list because, yeah, in the last 2 decades, I would say a simple access control list, it was a simpler world. As Matthew said, for example, in his last talk. So data was sitting in the data center. We had network security. We had our edge, lots of our firewalls, our zones, IDS, IPS, some load balancers, and WAF. It was, yeah, I would say it was simpler and much easier. But so if we look at the access control list, I use it as a good representation of a security policy. So we have a decision that we need to make. It used to be simpler, permit or deny, that's perfect, and a source that needs to reach a destination for a permitted service, and we used to log or record that connection. So it was much simpler at the time. So, but with data moving out our data center, and I'm not going to repeat what we have been talking through the entire day. So data is in SaaS applications, in SharePoint, in multiple locations, in IaaS, in blobs, and S3 buckets, etc. So if we want to apply the same abstracted level of control and visibility on our data, then we will find out it can be a bit challenging. Like, we still have a decision to make, as in allow or deny or restrict, like allow with less permissions. The source, yeah, that can be a user group, identity, of course, identity is a new parameter, that's another story. And the destination, in this case, if we move toward data and start in a way to secure data itself, to build our security controls around the files and not just around the systems, and we are all familiar with defense in depth. So yes, we have to secure the network access, we have to secure the identity, you have our MFAs, we have to secure the systems, the servers, the applications, all of them. But then, yeah, it also would make sense, really, if we take another step and we start from the center, from data itself, and start to build these controls around data. So in that case, destination can be file or directory, data class, data type, data site, for example. And then the permissions are much more complicated because the fact that data is hosted in multiple data repositories, it may be, again, like on SaaS or your Google Drive or OneDrive or whatever, these would define permissions in different ways. So we usually use a streamlined definition of data access permissions. We'll use the word CRUDs. Yeah, like CRUD is the familiar word as in create, read, update, or delete data. We also add share. So for example, if you're talking about Google Drive, create will be mapped to upload, for example. So that's a way to streamline or to have a standard. What are the permissions that user can have to data? And eventually, we should have an activity look, what's happening, who is accessing the data, and what the data is, and as we will see during our talk. So, and actually a very interesting quote from CISA. If you check CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model, you will find that they are defining Zero Trust as a shift from a location-centric model to a more data-centric model. So we are shifting from location-based and from the zones of our network, and we still have all these controls. But we have to start thinking about what's really happening to our data. What's happening? Again, I'm going to reference Rich when he was talking about insider risk, for example. So yeah, insider risk means that implies we are past all the perimeter defenses. We are in the inside, so we have to keep watching data itself. And yeah, that's mainly one of the we know that data is one of the 5 pillars of zero trust model.
So yeah, so the question is, why are we focused so much on data? Well, there's a quote that we say a lot in Varonis, which is nobody breaks into the bank to steal the pens, right? Data is what people are after, ultimately, either to encrypt it, to steal it, or to do both. And so we have to focus our security around a sort of data-first approach, right? Because if that's the thing that everybody's trying to get hold of, that's the thing we need to look after. But it isn't easy. And it isn't easy for a lot of reasons that are going to come up on the screen here, and some of which were also talked about in the last presentation. Even just understanding what data means to an organization is challenging, okay? Just if you go to particularly a large organization, ask them what their sensitive data is, and you ask 10 different departments, you'll get 10 different answers. And if you're lucky, you'll get some sort of consensus. Most organizations have usually tried to get a handle on this in some way, shape, or form. Maybe they've deployed some sort of classification and labeling in the past. Maybe they've tried to push out retention policies. Maybe they've tried to push out various sort of restrictions. But I'll pretty much guarantee that none of that has kept up with the changes that the business has made, whether it may be of divested business, acquired businesses, brought them in. And ultimately, even if their data estate has stayed fairly constant, it's growing at such a rate now that actually trying to keep up on just the data that they hold from week to week, from month to month, to year is nigh on impossible. I've put up there user confusion in terms of what does data mean to me in my role. But I quite easily could have put user apathy. Do I really care? I want to get here, I want to do my job, and I want to go home. Yeah, data protection is important, but it sounds like a you problem. It doesn't sound like a me problem. And ultimately, we've already talked about the fact that an average organization now uses over 100 SaaS-based applications, which is a huge amount. And this wasn't a problem that we found, even a few years ago, this explosion in these areas. If you're going to try and look at least privilege, if you're trying to look at least privilege and zero trust, the last speaker as well mentioned automation. How are you supposed to do this manually? How are you supposed to control the amount of data that's been pushed all over the place in multiple different applications with multiple permissions models, all of which can share, most of which are designed to do only one thing, and that's share? Without automation, how are you supposed to manage that? And then the final one is the roundabout that is regulations. They change all the time. I was lucky enough, as I mentioned, to go to Australia last year to work with our team there. And I'd never heard of the company Optus, but I'd heard of it by the time I'd left, because they'd been breached. They're the number 2 mobile phone provider in Australia. And they were breached. And because of that, the entire Australian privacy landscape has changed, because so many of their customers, new and old, were impacted. It was basically 1 in 3 Australians. So these compliance regulations change all the time as well, and it might not even be your company's fault, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to adhere to them as they change on a day-to-week basis.
Yeah, so I wanted to add some examples from real life. So I'm going to focus first on this number here, 20%. Yeah. So data risk analysis across 57 financial institutes, and as Matt mentioned, financial institutes are the ones that get most of the attacks. Brilliant. A new hire, on first day, they walk in the door, they have access to 20% of the business data. And to quantify this, 1 terabyte of data equates to 1.3 million files on average, of which 20,000 contain sensitive information, of which 1,800 are open to every employee. So that's 1,800,000 1,800 sensitive files open to every employee per terabyte. Okay, and I can say, like, it's not just a statistic, because like when I was a security consultant, so I used to work with tens, if not hundreds of customers, and I always, that's why, by the way, I still have my laptop always nearby, just in case. So I still have this habit. So yeah, we get access, VPN, or maybe we are on site and we get access to the customer site, to the customer network to do something, and I find a shared drive, okay, that I have to get, let's say, a network diagram or access some password database. And so I keep browsing, trying to find the file, and I find that in most cases, by default, you have access to a huge amount of data that I don't need, maybe because I was added to one of the Active Directory groups, for example, that will give me access to this server. But that made me inherit, huge access to lots of data that I don't need to do my job. So that's, how is that going to help Zero Trust or least privilege, for example? How is that going to show that the organization is trying to do all what they can to achieve Zero Trust or to achieve least privilege? So, and another example would be Microsoft 365, for example. So another analysis showed that open, like if you're using Microsoft 365, so you got data on OneDrive and SharePoint and Teams. So that means what's open to every user on average is 1 in 10 sensitive files, and that's almost 8% of the folders within Microsoft 365. So that's 1 in 10 sensitive files and 8% of folders. So about Steve, why this important?
Well, it's important because ultimately it comes down to the risk associated to a simple account compromise. This is something that we call the blast radius here at Varonis. It's a frightfully American term, but what it really means is, it means if I compromise an account through maybe an email compromise, as we saw in the presentation before, what can I do with that? And the answer is a lot in most of the organizations that we work with, okay? When we look at data within Office 365, we find on average that if you take a single terabyte on-prem and you move that same terabyte into the cloud, you're going to see a permissions growth of 10 to 20 times on the same amount of data. And that's simply because of the fact that if you think about it, how has the user model, how's the permission model changed? Well, it's gone from access control lists and IT managing AD groups to fully being in control of the users. I can share anything from my SharePoint site, from my team. I can share it with anyone. I can share it potentially externally. All of that is put front and center of the user experience. And so because of that, what we see is the blast radius, the amount of access a single account has, growing enormously as that data moves into the cloud. And unfortunately, if you don't know what that blast radius is, how can you put any controls in place to mitigate the risk on your data? So the first point of, okay, where do I start, from a point of view of protecting data, is quite simple. It's visibility. Okay, what is actually going on in my data estate, which is a term I'm now borrowed from the last speaker, right? What is happening? And this is a really difficult question to answer. And in order to do so, you kind of need 3 areas. You need to understand whether a piece of information is sensitive or not. You need to understand what access and permissions that piece of information has, and you need to know how that piece of information is being processed and ultimately how any of the other pieces are changing. Only with all 3 of those can you really give an understanding of what is happening to data within Office 365, with on-premise, or whatever other service that you're running. So if you look at the first one with sensitivity, the first thing we need to look at is, where is my data? And it sounds like an obvious question, but actually there's a lot of shadow IT out there. What's actually in scope for this data protection plan that we're putting in place? We then need to work with some sort of tool in order to classify and understand the differences between sensitive and non-sensitive data. because this differences and this drive to understand sensitive data is going to help us prioritize where we're going to start this remediation process. And without it, we're going to be in danger of either missing things that need to be regulated or over-restricting things that don't. We then need to look at how we record this sensitivity and ultimately what do we do with it. The act of classifying data in and of itself doesn't really give us any benefit. It shows us what data we have, but unless we do something with it, it's not really going to drive any sort of risk reduction or get us closer to that least privilege zero trust model. When we look at access and permissions, we really need to understand who is accessing the data, who can access it, and what, crucially, can they do with that access? How is that changed from when this data was on premises to when it's moved into Office 365? And ultimately, do we have an understanding of whether or not that access and the permissions associated to it are appropriate to that type of data at that time? And this is really, really hard to get an understanding of without some sort of tool that's able to aggregate this across multiple different repositories of information. The final one is then obviously activity. So how is my data being used? How is data being processed, managed, changed, edited, shared, all those CRUDS acronyms that we talked about before? What is going on with the data? Because whatever we do from a data protection perspective has to work within the framework of the way that the business uses that data. You know, an obvious thing to do would be say, well, the best way we can protect our data is not give anyone any access to it. Well, that would work really well. Unfortunately, the business might have something to say about that from a usability perspective. So somewhere between those two things, we need to put into place controls that allow users to work with the data in a way that in a safe and secure way. All three of these things matter equally. If you're missing one, you're missing a key piece of understanding what is going on with the data in your environment. Where they intersect is where we know, okay? And this could be across one environment you're looking at or multiple, okay? But we need this level of visibility because if we don't have it, everything that we put on top of this is a guess. And it's likely that we burn a lot of cycles trying to put controls in place that are rejected by the users or potentially don't deliver the sort of risk reduction that we actually desire.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So when we're thinking about, the next step, okay, so as Steve was saying, so we need to get data visibility. That's perfect. We were speaking about ChatGPT, like ChatGPT was mentioned, many times during the day. So I literally asked ChatGPT and told him, so please tell me, and yeah, I always use please when I talk to any bot. I don't know why, really, or even Alexa, so. I would say that, yeah, please tell me what are the best practices to apply data-centric security. And to be honest, like it gave me a perfect list, like almost 2 pages, and it's really, really great. As in, of course, it's derived from multiple other sources, so it's from multiple frameworks that we are all familiar with. So Brian has mentioned some during the day, for example, and again, CISA has a great maturity model for data, like for zero trust for data. But in reality, like it's not best practices, it's what I really can do, like what we do with customers. Like for example, if best practice says, yes, all data must be encrypted at rest. Yeah, that's right, but 80% of the business data is unstructured data. And how would I really ensure that is this really what we need? Like as in, for example, is that the practical advice? Like is that the best practice? Is this what I really advise the customer to do? Yeah, it's part of it, but there is a practical approach that we put together so that this is what we do with our customers who are going on that journey of moving to a more data-centric approach and at the same time, interested in reducing the data risk exposure and in a practical way and in an efficient way. So 9 steps for our practical approach. The first one, again, as Steve was saying, data risk assessment. This is where you start. This is where we start to get that visibility, at least of a subset of data. And there is lots of other vendors and partners that starts there as well. So data risk assessment, this is the first step. Once you visualize what's the state of my data, once you see for yourself, for example, that that's open access here, and this is stale data, and this is data that's shared with everyone, and this is publicly shared, etc. So that will help you move to step number 2 and really prioritize your objectives. Because again, practically, we will not be able to remediate all the risk areas at once. So clearly, for some businesses, for example, they would say, yeah, like my top priority will be removing open access, or maybe archiving stale data, or maybe locking down sensitive data, which is, again, something that you get from the data risk assessment, knowing where is your sensitive data, etc. So once you get that output from data risk assessment, then you can move to prioritizing your objectives. That will take us to step number 3, to define the business and data governance policies. So include the wider business. From what we say, one of the top reasons why moving to more data-centric security approach can be very challenging if the other, like business units, if the wider business, is not included. Because by the end of the day, they are the end users, as Steve said. Yeah, data security is important, but it's more like a you problem. So they have to be included. Everyone, like your HR, finance, engineering, development, whatever the stakeholders are. So usually, again, I'm sure most of us know that already. So in data governance, you have your steering committee, you have delegates or contributors from all actually should be representing ideally, they should be representing all your different business units.
So on that point, I used to work for Microsoft. I worked there for about 7 years, and I did a lot of projects with Microsoft 365. As it's known now, it wasn't known that 10, I don't remember what it was called. It's had about 5 rebrands since then. But anyway, a couple of things that I always learned was pick departments that are going to be open and receptive to the approach of changing data governance within the business, and accept you're not going to get everyone. Not everybody is going to come along on this particular ride. Right? Some people are just going to want to do it the way that they've always done it, and they're never going to deviate from that. And so users are important and absolutely vital, but we sometimes have to press ahead regardless, even if we've maybe not got the hearts and minds of everybody within the business. But once we understand and we can prioritize, and as I say, priority, sensitivity of data and classification is a great way of driving that prioritization, because otherwise it's very difficult to know where to start. What we want to start to do is then start to build out policies that will make tangible benefit with as minimum impact on users as possible. One that's a great example of that is open access. So this is where anyone can access anything just because they happen to be, the everyone group happens to be on access control list, or there's a link in Microsoft 365, everyone except external users, that kind of thing. These are great things to remove because they remove a large risk and they really impact the blast radius without necessarily having to go to each individual business unit and understand whether or not that link was appropriate. Well, of course it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate to have sensitive financial data open to everyone. We can probably all agree with that. Right? If we can't, we've got probably a bigger issue than we had, in terms of our engagement with the users. So we can start to target what I like to call the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that we can do to either get rid of open access, to remove stale data, to really make an impact on that blast radius without impacting users. We can start to then develop things that are going to work across the business, repeatable business processes that then we can take to individual business units with evidence of the fact that the risk reduction has worked over here before we start engaging with them around their own data problems. The next piece is then we have to audit and monitor what's going on. I talked about activity before. We need to understand the way that business uses data. There's no point saying to people, we're going to stop you sharing if that's a vital part of their job, whether that sharing is internal or external. And everything that we see from this auditing needs to feed back into that process. So when we take it to another department, we've learned our lessons from basically the mistakes we perhaps made in round 1, we don't make in round 2. And we talked about this a little bit earlier on. It's my firm belief that companies like Varonis effectively will, and our goal is to effectively automate and remove risk on data. Manual intervention is not going to work. There's too much data, there's too many permissions, there's too many locations, they're all different, they change every 5 minutes, the regulations are changing. This has to work almost autonomously. You have to be able to say to it, this is not an acceptable scenario, and let this software itself go away and remove it. So for example, if you say financial data should never be shared externally if it contains PII or PCI information, right? If that happens, the software runs and removes that risk. That's the only way that we're going to really be able to get on top of this and keep these risks pushed down moving forward. Because doing it once isn't enough. You come back a year later, pretty much everything's going to have gone back to the way it was.
Yeah. A month later, I would say.
Oh, a month later,
or
yeah,
actually
during
the actual change. So, yeah, but it's very important to remember that this is part of the wider security ecosystem and the wider tools that you have. So if I do like steps 1 to 6, this means that I have, I know where my data is. I know where is the sensitive data. I quantify the risk. I have a plan. I have clear defined policies, so I know what data, okay, this is what I have to do to sell data, this is what I have to do to open access to sensitive data, etc. And then, yeah, I have all the wider business engaged, and after that, we're aligning to these policies that came during that collaboration and that visibility, aligning to them. We're auditing and monitoring the activities as once we are moving toward these, okay, finally I have all this information and insights. They have to feed back to your SIEM, SOAR, whatever threat detection and response technology that you're using. So the wider, if you're using MDR or some extended detection and response capability. I've seen one of the data security vendors trying to coin the word DDR, or the expression DDR, as in data detection and response. But no one accepted that, like enough with the DR acronyms. So no one has referred to it as DDR. So that integration will actually feed into the same automation and orchestration piece as in, yeah, one practical example. Okay, so I can see that this user who clearly is allowed access on this server started to do, let's say, show some ransomware infection symptoms. So this account started to maybe encrypt data, for example, one of the symptoms, whatever the symptom is. So what's the response now? This data should feed, for example, to your MDR and match directly with a playbook. Okay, lock down the account, for example, or isolate that if there is an EDR component. So isolate that endpoint, for example. That's very, it's an idealistic scenario, I would say, to have this end-to-end capability. But yeah, that's what we're trying to move towards. And once we have that integrations defined to protect in place, then we should start providing evidence of the progress. And I would say mainly 3 reasons, to focus on this stage. The first one is, yeah, to measure and quantify the progress, and so that you can still get more engagements from the wider stakeholders. So you can say, for example, yeah, we have taken part, let's say, of the data, and we did our remediations, or we did these changes, and now for example, this data source, whatever it's a SharePoint site, for example, or a Windows server somewhere, it now, it's almost 99%, better now. You say there is no open access, etc. So once you have this evidence, you can get more engagement from the wider stakeholders. That's very important, to be honest, like this point, because again, that engagement from the wider business is very crucial. Second reason for evidence, besides tracking the progress, keep stakeholders involved and to prove compliance. That would be the third reason then, to prove compliance. So Rich mentioned, for example, one of the questions that can come out from, let's say, after a breach or something, or if you want to provide evidence that, yes, I do have a user behavior baseline. So this activity monitoring, the audit and monitor, will feed back to, yes, I have a baseline of user activity. I know what they are doing to my data. And at last, once I have evidenced that progress, I start rolling out what I have accomplished so far to the wider business. So the rest of my data, whether it's for example, other data stores or locations or other business units, sometimes like walk into the customer and say, yeah, this is the HR server, and this server is used, it's not related to a business unit, and this is, for example, a Dubai server. So it's not, again, it's more of everyone in that location is using it, and etc. So the scope then should expand by one of the different factors in here.
So we just wanted to round off now. Hopefully that's clear in terms of the approach that we would take if we were going to be doing this from scratch within an organization. I wanted to start with going back to my sort of original theme, which is visibility, okay? I spend a lot of time talking to organizations about particularly DLP projects. And most of the time, it's extremely tempting to think that we can avoid doing any of the work in terms of understanding access, removing stale data, getting down to least privilege, and just slap a DLP product at the end and hope it catches everything on the way out. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of reasons, but the main reason it doesn't work is if it's firing 3,000 times a day, no one's got time to actually review it. And nothing turns security off faster than annoyed end users, right? In my experience anyway. So spend the time on a data risk assessment. Understand either the whole data set or the specific filer or M365 environment you're looking at, and base your decisions on that visibility. You're not going to be able to do everything at once, okay? And from a data-centric approach, your sensitive data is more important than your non-sensitive data, right? Ultimately, that is a fact. And so if you can start with, maybe it's PCI, maybe it's GDPR, maybe it's something custom to your business that you need to find and need to understand how it's been actioned. If you can start with that, you can usually bring people along because you can say, well, look, this is the lifeblood of our organization. This is our crown jewels. And fundamentally, at the moment, we don't know what's happening to it. And that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to admit, but in most cases, it's true. And so if we can get the visibility and align it to areas of really high importance, we've got a really good foundation to build an approach on.
And the third advice would be work with partners. But no, really. So actually, a good thing, like I spent a lot of time on the other side, like working for a security consultant within financial services and different industries, really. So yeah, it always makes sense to reach out or work out with partners who have or share the same vision, or at least if they have done this with, like multiple times, or with similar maybe like peers, industry peers, etc. So that's, like this way you can, build on other experiences and trials and errors. And at last, invest in tools that support your priorities and outcomes, like as Steve said in point number 2. So all these, the orchestration, the automation, and all the different capabilities that we have mentioned in our practical approach, just look out at the market, start seeing, okay, like that's fine, these are my outcomes, I had a risk assessment, and this is what I want to do next. So start evaluating technologies and select tools that will help you to achieve mainly the outcomes. Consider, for example, third-party integrations. Again, consider the wider ecosystem that you already have. So if there is something that, for example, you are using AWS or Amazon or whatever your data are, make sure that, yes, that's covered, that's an integration, existing integration. The same goes for your MDR or any other security solutions that you have in place or security service. So consider all the different aspects before selecting the technology. And yeah, that's mainly it. So do we have time for questions?
Oh, we don't really, but if anyone's desperate for a question.
Yeah,
We'll be around.
Desperate question.
We're standing in between coffee, so that's not going to be good,
It is coffee time
Yeah,
now,
there you go,
exactly. And I believe you will be around for the coffee, so I'm sure people can ask you questions in person.
Yeah?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So yeah, thanks all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Cheers.
Stephen, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you.